Thank you, Next Village, and thank you everyone for attending. Are we ready to explore North Beach neighborhood, traveling back through time over 100 years with 100 images? Although our travels do not begin at this location, which is the intersection of Columbus and Kearny, the top historic photograph, 1900, is titled by the photographer J.B. Monaco as the gateway to North Beach. So I thought, what better way to begin than at the gateway to North Beach? So we're going to rest here for just a second and think about turning left at this location. It would take you to the heart of North Beach. And just an aside, when the photo was taken, which was around 1900, the street we now know as Columbus was actually called Montgomery. Probably everyone knows that. And the official name change came in 1909. So our meanderings today actually begin with this 1851 photograph, one of the earliest photographs of North Beach, as we see here, nestled between Russian Hill on the left, Telegraph Hill on the right. And it looks to me like that early settlement had established itself in a very peaceful looking little valley. And the hill wasn't called Telegraph, it was called Loma Alta, and it was so named by the Spaniards until 1853, when the official first telegraph in California replaced the semaphore. Thus, it became Telegraph Hill. So let's take a closer look. We have a map at the top that shows the area we now know as North Beach, but that was the original shoreline around Bay, Powell, and North Point streets. The 1865 image below shows the real beach, and there really was a beach. Eventually, it was filled with land in the late 19th century and became the location for warehouses, fishing wharves, docks, and this newly formed shoreline. So here we can see Telegraph Hill at the far right, and we are facing east, but now we are facing west from Greenwich and Kearny in 1865. We can see the view west over North Beach towards Black Point and the Golden Gate. And if you were to walk here today and situate yourself as in the lower photograph, you would be at the top of the Greenwich Street around Kearny. And this is where we could really begin our walk through history. So what was happening to Loma Alta in the mid 1800s? Well, this is one of the things that was happening. At Broadway in Montgomery, 1864, looking west, this was called the Big Cut, the quarrying of Telegraph Hill. When you pause here and stand on the corner of Broadway and Montgomery, you might want to think about this quaint horse and wagon. But I have actually a more interesting idea. Why don't you think about the cemetery? And what cemetery might that be? It existed between 1825 and 1857 between Sansom, Battery, Broadway, and Vallejo, with approximately 100 remains. And I'm going to read from the San Francisco Bulletin of January 2nd, 1857. Quote, "During a storm, a miniature avalanche of rock and dirt occurred at a quarry on Telegraph Hill on Sansom, north of Vallejo." Picture that. The fall exposed several coffins which were buried high on the hill. And on examination, it was found that a great number of graves were scattered about. Eventually, the remains were taken to the Yerba Buena Cemetery, which was about 15 acres, and wait for it, bounded by Market, McAllister, and Larkin. So that's a visual. Actually, that's around now where we have City Hall, and I'm not going to make any comments about that. On the other hand, if you don't want to think about the cemetery, you might prefer to think about these two views at the top. Some of my favorite, they're looking east from Broadway at Kearny, 1867. Once an impressive mass of rock and soil, the outcropping that we see here that was Telegraph Hill was partially demolished to make way for Broadway. Quarrying of the hill was used for various purposes, including the sea walls. Perhaps this is a good time to visit the top of the hill. As it looked in the early 1800s, it was home to goats that you can see the white dots and tents. The signal station is the white dot at the top. You can see the flag. It seems like the white dot grew to be an actual concrete tower, and the tents were replaced with million-dollar dwellings. And most sadly, the goats have also been replaced. So let's take a look at that white dot closer. Around 1882, we can see it at the top. And if you look very closely, if this was enlarged, you could see the words observatory on top of the white dot. The building in the forefront is 1301 Montgomery, and it is considered the oldest brick building in San Francisco, built around 1852. It was a grocery store from 1854 to 1880. It was a barber shop in 1915. It was a pool hall in 1920, and now it's a residence. And I checked with Trulia, and she says it's worth over $3 million. Here's a closer look at some of the wooden dwellings in 1900. If you look closely, you can see the chicken and the dog. They are roaming around their land peacefully. And that reminds us that the location, the summit, wasn't always home to the perfectly engineered concrete architecture we see at the right. It's about the same location, actually. The photo at the top left is one of my very favorites. I love this image. The quaint wooden structures clinging all over Telegraph Hill, the laundry on the line, the four people in the front, and behind them on the Filbert steps is 228 Filbert, the Carpenter Gothic Philip Brown house built in 1869. And at the lower right, we can see a cottage. Well, that's the same house, about 150 years later. Now, if we were to back off from that hill and take a look from here, we would be at the Filberts, at the base of the Filbert steps. We can see the German castle at the top, horse and wagon. Believe it or not, probably quite a few years before this historic photograph was taken, this was a garbage dump. So now take a look at it at the lower right. There's a big change here. Speaking of steps, we just saw the Filbert steps. Well, these are the Greenwich steps in 1903. It was quite a trek up the stairs and the dirt trails, meandering up this hill. This photo was taken at Greenwich and Sansom, again in 1903. But the steps and the trails weren't the only way up the hill. You could have gotten up to that German castle you can see up at the top by the Telegraph Hill Railway. We're looking at an 1884 photograph of it. Businessman and developer Frederick Lehman received approval for this line in May 1882. The photo's 1884. The railway ran along Greenwich from Powell to the Pioneer Park Observatory. We can see it at the top. But after a bad accident and declining ridership, the line closed in 1886. But I want to speak a little bit about Lehman, Frederick Lehman. Those wooden dwellings were eventually joined by the German castle, also known as the Pioneer Park Observatory and Lehman's Castle, that he situated in Pioneer Park in 1876. The Pioneer Park was established in 1876 in celebration of the US centennial. And it was purchased, the site was purchased by businessmen for $12,000 and donated to the city on condition that it would be a park. The pavilion we're looking at opened on July 4th, 1882. It had a restaurant. That looks like fun, I have to say. It had a restaurant, a concert hall, and rail service, and we can see the rail car that had just arrived, and there's the riders posing for the photographer. Sadly, by the 1890s, the castle was in neglect, and on July 25th, 1903, fire damaged this beautiful structure, and what remained was taken off for firewood. So the castle did not survive, but Pioneer Park did and became home to Coit Tower. We can see it here under construction in 1933. Coit Tower is both an officially designated National Register landmark and San Francisco landmark number 165. So if we were to walk down from Pioneer Park into the neighborhood in the 1920s, upper photograph, we could have seen a woman standing here in front of Meisel's store at 1300 Montgomery. Meisel was a German immigrant, Hermann Meisel. He opened his store in 1882 and he sold groceries and sundries, but he was most famous for selling some of the best whiskey in town. Years later, that location became the Dead Fish Cafe. And now the street is lined with mature trees. We can see at the lower right, endless vehicles and really pricey dwellings. So if we were standing here on Montgomery and we turned around, we would be looking at one of my favorite locations in, well, all of San Francisco. We're looking at the structure at 1254 Montgomery. It is a National Register landmark, and it's still there, even though it has gone under quite a few revisions, renovations, alterations. It is an Italianate residence that was constructed around 1865 on the site, believe it or not, to be the location of Hudson's windmill. The windmill probably fell to the fire of July 4th, 1861, as did many of the wooden residences that we were looking at. So if we were standing on that corner and we walked just a few steps, we would be here on the north side of Union near Montgomery in 1940. Most of the houses date back to the 1800s. And in the 1940 photograph, we can see a lot of construction in the front there. That was road work by the Department of Public Works. They were upgrading the street. In the background, we can see Treasure Island, complete with the ongoing Golden Gate International Exposition. And really not that much has changed. But on the other side of the street, really not much has changed. This is the south side, and these are extremely historic dwellings. The former Cooney home in the center at 291 Union is one of the oldest dwellings in San Francisco, built around the mid-1800s, say 1850, by John Joseph Cooney, an Irish immigrant. It had a grocery store on the bottom until 1906. And the cottages adjacent were built around 1857. And again, not much has changed, except for one thing, the cost of housing. Someone told me they lived in one of the cottages to the right, and it sold several years ago, the cottage, for well over $1 million. I'm going to digress in time just for a bit because we're in the right location for the top image, which is, it is a look back in history, but this is movie history. That image is a scene from the 1947 film Dark Passage, an actual scene from the movie, starring Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. The apartment building at 1360 Montgomery was designed in 1938 by architect Irvin Goldstein, that is S-T-I-N-E, Stein, in streamlined modern style. It is charming, and it's still there. Lauren Bacall's character, Irene Jansen, lived in the building for the movie, and for years, a life-size image of Bogart was kept in the window. I believe it was cardboard, and it was put there by the residents. So I have a suggestion that when you're in the area, you might want to look for Bogart and Bacall. But in the meantime, if we were to go back in time a bit now again, and back off the hill to Kearny near Pacific, this is what we would have seen. That's all the wooden dwellings on the top of the hill, 1890. And we can see the Kearny steps at the top left. So we're going to take a closer look at the Kearny steps, April 4th, 1937. And you can make a note that the Fior d'Italia restaurant was still there. Another famous restaurant on Broadway was the Buon Gusto. It was one of the leading Italian restaurants in San Francisco, besides the Fior d'Italia. And it was here at 534 Broadway, and it is now a parking lot. Actually, each building, each location has a huge story, but we would be here for days. So this is very abbreviated, but know that when you do stand here and you remember these images, you are standing in an area that was just rich with history, including the El Trovatore restaurant at the top in the early 1900s, 504 Broadway. It was owned by Archimede Punicelli, an Italian pioneer who arrived from Lucca, Italy, my ancestral home, to San Francisco at the age of 11. And surprisingly, that building still stands. So you are on Broadway, but if you were to walk west, it would take you to Columbus. And I'm sure you all recognize the Cavalli building at 522 Columbus. It originally housed the Cavalli bookstore, Libreria Italiana. The building was built in 1913, designed by the architect Italo Zanolini in the Italian Renaissance Revival style, and it is now the location of Vesuvio's Cafe. Vesuvio's was created as a bohemian gathering spot and became popular for members of the Beat generation, including Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti. I interviewed Lawrence 3 times for 3 articles in the Italian newspaper Italo-Americano, and he insisted that we speak Italian and that I call him Lorenzo, and he insisted on calling me Caterina. So, with that in mind, this is the location of City Lights Bookstore at the lower right, but at one time it was another location of the Cavalli bookstore, Libreria Italiana. In 1907, Oliver Everett designed the building at 261 Columbus in the classical revival style. Cavalli moved into one of the 4 storefronts in 1907. City Lights was founded in 1953 by Lorenzo and Peter Martin. You know, as I mentioned before, there's so much history and so many locations that it annoys me that there are so many that I have to leave out things like Caesar's Restaurant and the original US. So maybe another time, but for now, we're going to make a left turn and walk down Columbus to Pacific. Columbus Avenue was the main thoroughfare through North Beach District. It was built in the 1870s as Montgomery Street, as I mentioned before, and it connected downtown with the waterfront. The street's name, again, was changed to Columbus in 1909. The wagon is carrying barrels of beer, barreling down Montgomery Street, and it probably just delivered beer to the Buon Gusto restaurant, which is just behind it. Just about the same location. 1900s, well into the 1900s. We see a streetcar on Columbus. Yes, there was a streetcar. It was called the E-Line, the Municipal Railway E-Line. And it traveled from the Ferry Building to the Presidio, and part of that route was on Columbus. The E-Line was built or established as part of the transportation for the 1915 Panama Pacific Exhibition. And if we take a look at the photo, which I could look at all day, in the back, in the distance, we see the spires of St. Francis Church at Vallejo. And here we are, a very early version of St. Francis Church, probably maybe soon after it was built. It is now San Francisco landmark number 5. Oh, we're standing on Vallejo, just east of Grant. Okay, and we're going to visit this area again in about 100 years, which is actually about 5 minutes. So right now we've taken a short walk down Columbus to Powell. Guess what this was? The Washington Square Theater, March 11, 1916. It says on the marquee, Masquerade Ball. Oh, how about that? It opened in 1908 as a venue for Italian drama, music, opera, and variety shows. Actually, before the earthquake, the site was a Russian church, but it was burned and destroyed in the 1906 disaster. The theater we see here had 1,000 seats, 10 cents each. In 1930, it became the Milano. In 1937, it became the Palace. In 1974, it became the Pagoda Palace. And in 2013, it was demolished. So we'll ponder this for a second, and then we're going to turn around and cross the street to Washington Square. And it looked like this on July 4th, 1862, where soldiers are gathering for a 4th of July celebration. Russian Hill in the background, and the photo below Russian Hill in the background, that's quite a change. Obviously, from this top photograph, even the one below, Washington Square was really an idyllic respite from the city. In the early days, the earliest days, it was the dairy ranch and potato patch of Signora Juana Briones. It has been a goat pasture and a cemetery. In 1850, the first mayor of San Francisco, John Geary, declared the land a public square. The Italian community called it Il Giardino, the garden. Definitely the top image is idyllically peaceful. We can see the German castle up on the hill. Washington Square Park is San Francisco landmark 226. It was a safe place at that time for a family outing. We can see a mother and her son sitting on the bench. We can see St. Peter's Episcopal Church at the top left, at the corner of Filbert and Stockton. This is a J.B. Monaco photograph of his wife, Catherine, and his son, Dante. J.B. Monaco was known as the Dean of North Beach photographers. I'm going to take a few moments to mention J.B. because I've used quite a number of his photographs in my presentations and my books. His grandson, Richard, Dick Monaco, donated over 50 images to me several years before he passed away. Just a little bit about JB. He did use the initials, but his name was Giovanni Battista. He immigrated to the United States in 1875 from Switzerland, settled in San Francisco in 1888. The Monaco studios, one of which is at the lower right, well, his studios occupied several locations over the years, including 205 Columbus. In 1923, he purchased a building at 234 Columbus, another studio. His photographic collection is a gem. It's impressive, and it spans the years 1856 to 1938. This is JB in 1908. At the age of 52, he passed away in 1938. And I feel very fortunate to possess original scans of many of his wonderful photographs. In the center top, we are looking at the Monaco residence where Dante was born. It was at 625 Vallejo, the corner of what was then Montgomery and now is Columbus, and now the site of Cold Hardware. Another Monaco photograph, another one of my favorites. I love that top scene. It's a gentleman with two children. We're looking down the Kearney steps. We can see a streetcar. There's a dog in the middle of the road down at the bottom with children, and the skyline in the back. It's absolutely stunning. What these people didn't know was that a few days later, we would have a disaster. This was taken in April 1906. A few days later, North Beach would look like this. At the top, we're looking down Columbus to the Columbus Tower that's barely standing. And the group of people in the center are standing in front of what was one of the Monaco studios, and they are Frank Giovannessi, Lydia Cavalli, and Nina Monaco. JB took the photograph of his family. Another JB Monaco photograph, and there's Frank. He is standing by St. Francis Church next to a fire hydrant that didn't work. Ironic, very ironic. So I wanted to find a location that you could see the church and see a fire hydrant. 114 years later. And you probably know that over 600 people at one time were living in Washington Square after the earthquake and fire. Most of the camps were taken down, removed, closed by 1908. After the disaster, Monaco established a studio here on Broadway. You can see it at the far right. And that is around the area of the Kearney Steps where Vanessi's was eventually. Muddy streets, lots of bricks, all gone. So 9 years after the earthquake and fire would bring us to this scene in 1915, and time has passed. San Francisco recovered, North Beach recovered. We're looking at San Francisco landmark number 33, the Sentinel building, which I call the Columbus Tower. And now we're at the intersection of Broadway and Columbus in the 1920s. The building at the far right housed a accordion manufacturing building office. The middle building was, for a long time, was a bank. And the same location, some years later, streetcar. There was a streetcar on Columbus and a streetcar on Broadway. Columbus in the 1940s, around Green Street, the cupola of the gorgeous building in the center is gone, but the spires of St. Peter's and Paul are in the background, still in the background at the current photo. A little closer look at the spires of St. Francis. This is Columbus near Grant, 1941, and that's the E line. So speaking of St. Francis Church, here we are, March 16, 1961. Do we know what's happening? Well, it's not just buildings and businesses that have come and gone. Art came and went. I remember the day when this statue of St. Francis was being installed on the steps of the church, August 27, 1955. And I also remember the day it was removed, which we're looking at here in 1961. The statue was created by Italian sculptor and artist Beniamino Bufano. And I remember my mother telling me the story that supposedly the enormous sculpture interfered with wedding and funeral processions, and was cracking the steps. So it was removed in 1961, and it's now in front of, well, last time I saw it, it was in front of the Memorial Hall on Fisherman's Wharf. The other major church in the neighborhood is Saints Peter and Paul, and we see the West Tower still under construction here in 1933. It was so impressive, this Romanesque style building, so imposing, that Cecil B. DeMille featured it in his silent film, 1923, The Ten Commandments. Both of these are actually pretty peaceful looking scenes, but they weren't always. Here's something to keep in mind when you walk by Saints Peter and Paul. January 30, 1926, a bomb exploded in the alley behind it, Brant Alley. At that time, there was no major damage, but a few months later on May 9th, another bomb exploded in front of the church and caused severe damage. It damaged the doors, windows, marble, and broke many windows in residences nearby. So hundreds of people, apparently in their night clothes, rushed to the scene along with police officers. 5 months later, October 29th, another bomb exploded, causing even greater damage. January 9th, 1927, a fourth bomb, the fourth bomb was placed in the corridor leading to the basement. And during investigations, it was found that there were anti-clerical groups that disliked the Catholic Church at that time. So 13 undercover police officers were stationed inside and outside. This would have been in 1927. 13 undercover police, inside, outside, some of them disguised as women. Others were smuggled into the building in laundry and or bread baskets. March 6, 1927, two men approached the church from Powell Street. One of them laid a package against the building, struck a match, and lit a fuse. Police opened fire and killed him on the spot, and they put out the fuse. The other man tried to flee across Washington Square, and he was shot by police, and he died a few months later. It wasn't just the church that was damaged or demolished. Even entertainment came and went. This was the Green Street Theater at 625 Green near Columbus. Originally, it was a live theater and then a cinema. And the theater was raised in 1955 to make way for a parking lot. Many businesses came and went over time. This is Rossi Market, where my mother went on January 18th, 1955 at 627 Vallejo Street at Columbus. The building was constructed in 1932, and Rossi Market was here for about 50 years before closing in 2004. It is now Cole Hardware. And speaking of hardware stores, here was my favorite, Figoni Hardware on Grant Avenue, 1351 Grant. It opened in 1907 and remained open and operating for 91 years, selling hardware and an imported Italian goods. And I'm holding up one of the glasses I bought there many years ago. It's an Italian flag glass. Okay, so I looked it up. Hardware is defined as tools and machinery. So I thought the segue here to the Simmons Mattress Factory made perfect sense and works for me. It's another business that came and went, located at 295 Bay at Powell and North Point. Simmons made iron and brass beds and box springs. And I know a little bit about this Simmons Mattress Factory because my father worked here for decades. I've been on that pedestrian walkway, crossing between warehouses when my mother and I visited my father. At that time in the 50s, it was allowed. I clearly remember these large windows and the loud noises from the machinery. The Simmons complex has been replaced with a shopping area on the lower level, the North Point Vistas apartments on one side and the North Point apartments on another. This was the original beach in North Beach. Speaking of being the child of immigrant factory workers, how about the Roma Macaroni Factory on Francisco near Grant, where my mother was employed? It was a wooden building that clung to the hill and was demolished to be replaced with luxury condos. And these images are quite the contrast, same location. Quite the contrast from a macaroni factory that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week during World War II, making pasta for the military people, our military people, to the current $3 million condos. As I mentioned, there is so much history in the North Beach neighborhood over the past 100 years within these approximately 315 acres. The area bounded by Greenwich, Sansom, Montgomery, and Green would be officially designated the Telegraph Hill Historic District. We're looking at it. Designated in 1986, and Telegraph Hill itself is San Francisco landmark number 91. And so how am I going to end? I'm going to end with my favorite landmark, number 121. And of course, anyone that knows me would know that it was going to be about Julius Castle, where my mother would take me for walks from our home on Greenwich. We would visit her macaroni factory and talk with the Italian ladies, and then we'd continue our walk through the neighborhood and end up here, Greenwich and Montgomery. She liked the view, and I liked the castle. And this is the way it looked in those days around 1957. So much history that over 100 people attended my recent Julius Castle presentation. So I'm going to close with my favorite San Francisco landmark that I'm happy to say has not come and gone. Julius Castle has a new paint job, the lower right, and the owner tells me it will reopen as the grand landmark it is in the near future. So in closing, I would recommend a walk up to Greenwich and Montgomery because it definitely is a journey through time. The end.